Good evening. On behalf of Sarah Meister and myself, we would like to thank you all for joining us here in this theater or through the live stream. My name is Abigail Lapin-Dardashti. I'm the Mellon Museum Research Consortium Fellow in the Department of Photography and a PhD candidate at the CUNY Grad Center. Since September, I've had the incredible privilege to be mentored by Sarah and work with a collection of Brazilian prints that she is responsible for bringing to MoMA. Sarah and I conceived of tonight as an introduction of sorts to convey to our North American colleagues some of what thrills us about photography in Brazil at Midcentury. If you want to learn more, please do join us or watch the live stream of tomorrow's conference at the Grad Center, whose exciting presentations you will find outlined on a sheet within tonight's program or on the website of the Center for the Humanities. So the insert you have in your program is the basic schedule for tomorrow, and we really hope that you could come. There are many thanks to give to our MoMA and CUNY colleagues for the realization of this event. First and foremost, I would like to thank Ana Indich Lopez, my advisor and an esteemed scholar of Latin American art, without whom none of this would have been possible. As an MRC fellow, I'm following in her footsteps, as she has collaborated on many curatorial projects with the museum over the past 20 years, while also being a professor at the Graduate Center. Anna has shaped much of how I frame Brazilian art in both my dissertation and my work as an MRC fellow, and I'm incredibly grateful for her ongoing support. Beyond the many colleagues at MoMA that made tonight's event possible, Sarah and I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to the families of Tomás Farcas and Geraldo de Barros, as well as our distinguished panelist and moderator. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the generous support of MoMA's International Council, as well as several sources of funding at the Graduate Center. And last but not least, I would like to thank Sarah, without whom talking about Latin American photography at MoMA would be short of impossible. Finally, I would like to introduce our moderator, Edward Sullivan, who really needs no introduction. And I'm not going to read his bio, because as he taught me, reading bios is boring. Edward's scholarship on Latin American art is the foundation of our field. His work extends to the many scholars that he has mentored, and I'm deeply honored to count myself in that group. Starting with his Guggenheim exhibition, Brazil, Body and Soul, in 2011, Edward shaped the introduction of Brazilian art to a US audience and has an indelible impact on our work here at MoMA. Without further ado, Edward Sullivan.
So thank you very much. I'm thrilled and it's a very deep pleasure to have been asked to be the moderator of the first session of what will, I'm sure, be an extraordinarily enriching and fascinating panel or series of panels that constitute this symposium on Brazilian photography and really on Brazilian culture, knowing what is to come and knowing the subjects of the panelists' work. I think that between today and tomorrow we will have a much enriched knowledge of the visual culture of this extraordinary country, which I have to admit is one of my great life passions. I began going to Brazil many, many years ago, and it is a place about which I've written, about a place that more than anything else has nurtured my imagination, and my many friends and colleagues in Sao Paulo and in Rio and Belo Horizonte and Salvador and so on and so forth have always been of extraordinary importance to me. And so I'm delighted to be here. And this seems to be Brazilian week, Brazilian month, Brazilian year in the United States. Not only at MoMA and at the Graduate Center are we celebrating Brazilian photography, but the very beautiful exhibition of Lygia Clark was here in 2014, of Lygia Pape at the Met. All day on Thursday, the Metropolitan Museum, there is a conference on Lygia Pape, at which people like Paulo Herkenhoff will be speaking. There is the great, I think, really wonderful exhibition of Helouise that began in the fall in Pittsburgh. It's now in Chicago. It's coming here to New York at the Whitney in July. And so we are completely Brazilianized, and all to the good, I think. So that's a very happy fact. It's also very significant. I'm just going to read a little bit. I usually only speak extemporaneously, but I want it to be very concise, and I don't want to go off in tangents. So I'll read just a bit, and then we will commence with our speakers, all of my colleagues and friends from Brazil. I think it's very significant that this symposium is a joint effort between the Graduate Center and the Museum of Modern Art, as the Graduate Center has been very long had strength in 19th century modern and contemporary Latin American art, with the efforts of my colleagues, as Abigail mentioned, Ana Indich Lopez, Catherine Manthorne, and also the attention that is paid to art of the hemisphere by other very distinguished professors at the Graduate Center like Claire Bishop and David Josselet. And also it's the students. There's many students, which I also, as professor at the Institute of Fine Arts of NYU, where we've also had a fairly long trajectory of teaching and investigation in Latin American art. And I teach many of the students from the Graduate Center, and my dear friend and colleague Abigail is one of them, who was my MA student. And so I think it is a group of Latin Americanists in New York that I think have formed, many of them very interested in Brazil, doing dissertations on Brazilian art, and have formed a coterie of intellectuals and people who, through their energy, have worked in amazing ways, organizing lecture series and panels and so on. So I think there's a very, very good sense of camaraderie among the people who are involved in Brazilian studies and Latin American studies, largely described. In addition, the collaboration between the Graduate Center and MoMA has to be noted particularly and appreciated, because after all, the Museum of Modern Art is the premier exhibiting and collecting institution of Latin American art since its founding in 1929, and through the personal interest of the original founding director Alfred Barr and his colleague Lincoln Kirstein, who formed the original Latin American collection, also through the stimulus and the interest of the Rockefeller family and other collectors of the 1930s and 40s. And Brazil, incidentally, has always played a highly significant role in MoMA's trajectory, beginning with important acquisitions in the 30s and 40s, and the presentation also in the 1940s of important exhibitions such as Brazil Builds Architecture Old and New of 1943, and the monographic show in 1940 of Cândido Portinari, which was at the Museum of Modern Art. And we should not forget the great importance for the U.S. to discover Brazilian art and visual culture through the presence in 1939 and 1940 of Oscar Niemeyer's Brazilian Pavilion at the New York World's Fair, that had great many links with MoMA, many links in terms of what was presented, what was later acquired. And so there's a very, very interesting subset of connections between Museum of Modern Art, Brazil, and the creation of the New York World's Fair. Later, and much more recently, through the efforts and generosity of Patricia Phelps de Cisneros, Brazil again surfaced on the horizon of MoMA's collecting and exhibiting patterns. And the recent gift of over 100 works from the Cisneros collection features many Brazilian concretists and neo-concretists, and the Latin American curators, first Paulo Herkenhoff, and more recently Luis Perez Oramas, who is the Estrelita Brodsky curator, so named for the art historian and arts promoter, S.T. Brodsky, who was also a student at the Institute of Fine Arts, have also moved forward Brazilian interest at the Museum of Modern Art, and we are looking very much forward to having what I'm sure will be a spectacular Tarsila do Amaral exhibition here at MoMA very shortly in the summer. Now, Latin American and Brazilian photography has been actively promoted by the Museum of Modern Art, and one of our speakers, Sarah Meister, is a spokesperson and a passionate advocate for this area of study and collecting. The 2015 exhibition that she and her colleagues organized of the Argentine-German photographers Greta Stern and Horacio Coppola, I thought was a model of excellence, and Sarah has recently made several trips to Brazil to bolster MoMA's photography photography collection in that area, with, for example, a number of images by the Fotocine Clube Bandeirantes of Sao Paulo, a rather now little known, but certainly will be shortly, very well-known organization that intersected very vividly with the burgeoning movements of concrete art that virtually came to define the essence of a modern spirit of Brazil's largest city, Sao Paulo, along with its concomitant movement, neo-concrete art in Rio de Janeiro. Abigail Lappin has been working with Sarah on several forthcoming exhibitions that will feature modernist photography from Brazil. Now, to the subject of our conference. The theme of race and representation could not be more timely. The reasons for this are both abundant and obvious. Black bodies, black faces, black citizens of Brazil are, like their North American counterparts, contested presences in the minds of many of the powers that be in political circles in both Brazil and the US and elsewhere. The Black Lives Matter movements in the United States, as well as the many projects in Brazil of self-determination and self-representation, are necessary and integral components of the contemporary artistic as well as the political landscape. Historically, they have played equally significant roles, as the papers in this conference this evening and tomorrow will indicate. The presentations here will delve into a multitude of matters, not only of race, but of larger questions of ethnicity in Brazil and by extension throughout the Americas. The initial interventions will, as well, add a historical dimension this evening to our understanding of photography, not only in the context of race, but that of the wider comprehension of questions of Brazilian identity and nation formation. These lectures will examine, investigate, among other things, the use of photography as the projection of modernity in Brazil and a concretization of the country as an open door for new ideas, which were coming about in the 40s, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, while attempting to preserve a particular sensibility that has been called Brasilidade. I will simply say a few words about the panelists, and then they will present their papers. After the presentations, a dialogue between them and the audience will add to our understanding of the complex series of proposals that will have been made throughout this evening. I look forward to your own interventions in the audience. So think up interesting and clever questions, please, as the panelists are speaking. Helouise Costa of MAC USP, or the Museum of Contemporary Art at the Universidade de São Paulo, is one of Brazil's most distinguished photo historians of this era. In charge of the photographic collections of the museum, her areas of expertise spanned the 1940s through the 1980s. She will present a paper regarding putting post-war Brazilian photography on the map. Roberto Conduru is well known to anyone with even the most remote familiarity with the complex history of Afro-Brazilian art. Roberto is professor at the State University of Rio de Janeiro, and he has a long history of researching all aspects of black arts in the country, both traditional and contemporary, as well as curating exhibitions on these subjects in museums in South America, Europe, and the United States. This evening, he will speak about architecture and Africanisms in the work of such photographers as the American G.E. Kidder Smith, the French-born photographer Pierre Verger, and the Brazilian José Medeiros. Heloísa Espada is curator at the renowned Instituto Moreira Salles and is the author of books on such key figures of mid-20th century avant-garde movements as Hércules Barsotti and Gerardo de Barros. Her talk will focus on the photography of Peter Schreier, who literally created for the public a visual concretization of the first Sao Paulo biennial. And Sarah Meister, doyenne of photography here at the Museum of Modern Art, has curated and written eloquently about such wide-ranging topics as the work of Bill Brandt, Eugène Atget, and Joseph Albers. Her dedication to South American photography, especially that of Brazil, is a fairly new passion, and she has pursued it with vigor and insight. She will speak to us tonight about MoMA, photography as modern art. So what I propose to do is that each of the participants will come to the microphone. The rest of us will sit so we can actually see the images, and then at the end we'll all proceed to the table and have our dialogue. So thank you very much, and please enjoy as palestras.
and good evening. Thank you for the presentation. I just want to thank Sarah Meister for providing me this opportunity to be here to talk about my research, Abigail for making everything easier, and the audience for coming. I have some friends here, and this is a very important moment for me. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. I will read my paper because I think that's the best way to manage with the minutes I have. So I will do that. Putting post-war Brazilian photography on the map. Modern photography in Brazil developed on three main fronts: documentary humanistic production, photojournalism, and the photo club experience. My focus is on the latter, in particular the Photocine Club Bandeirante, whose photographers have achieved the greatest visibility in the recent years. It's perhaps surprising to discover that as recently as the 80s, their production was practically unknown. 30 years later, the scenario has changed radically. This presentation will be divided into two sections. Firstly, I will try to show that the steps leading to the recognition of modern Brazilian photography production have a history beginning only in the mid-80s. Then I intend to analyze the unfolding of this process and raise questions about articulating different cultural contexts within a history of photography. As a researcher, I was at once an agent and a witness of the phenomenon I intend to analyze. In 1985, the National Art Foundation, FUNARTE, attached to the Brazilian Ministry of Culture, opened a competition for research grants on the theme Brazilian Culture, Tradition and Rupture. As a recently graduated student, I tried for and obtained the support for making the first systematic study of modern photography produced in Brazil within the board of photo clubs. The project was developed with the researcher Renato Rodrigues da Silva, with the aim of investigating the moment of rupture of Brazilian photography with pictorialism. We soon identified the Photocine Club Bandeirante as the most important and well-structured focus of photographic production in the country between the 40s and 60s. It also took a pioneering role in the discussion of the modernist aesthetic, armed with a list of names acquired in the publications of the period and the telephone book. We managed to locate a great number of photographers who brought us in contact with collections that had long been stored away. The archive of the Photocine Club Bandeirante, in its turn, offered us a remarkable experience by allowing us to examine the broad range of the production of its associates and providing us access to a complete collection of their bulletin, a publication recording the club's activities over more than 3 decades. Considered by many to be traditional and elitist, the production of the Bandeirante appeared to us both potent and revealing of the contradictions within the country modernization. In 1995, our study entitled Modern Photography in Brazil was published by FUNARTE. The relative obscurity of this artistic production began to change in the 2000s when modern photography became more widely known and entered important Brazilian art museum collections. Without wishing to trace a detailed panorama of the period, I would emphasize the first master's dissertations on modern photography, a great number of individual and collective shows, an increase in the number of catalogs and books published on the theme, including a new edition of Modern Photography in Brazil, revised and updated in 2004. From the middle of the 2000s, the art galleries became aware of the potential of what was still an unexplored market and began to commercialize modern photography both in Brazil and abroad. Here we see the first and the second edition of our book. In the 2010s, the visibility of modern photography produced in Brazil increased exponentially. Of note in this period are an increase in academic investigation, not only in Brazil, but also in North American and European universities. The diversification of research to include a wide number of studies of previously unknown Brazilian photo clubs and the circulation of images abroad. The first shows by lesser-known photographers such as Marcel Giraud, Chico Albuquerque, and Gertrude Salchow, one of the rare women photographers active in the Photo Cine Club Bandeirante. The issue of gender first arose at this time. The increased presence of modern photography in international shows and fairs due to the initiative of gallery owners, institutions, and even the heirs of the photographers themselves. The innumerable publishing projects undertaking offering new contributions to a broader theoretical knowledge of the area, being more than simple vehicles for publicizing the work of the photographers. And finally, we also have to draw attention to the recent wave of acquisitions by the Tate Modern in London and the Museum of Modern Art in New York as a clear signs of a still broader and long-term phenomenon. Examining modernism and the universalizing narratives of Western art history has long been a recurrent theme. In recent years, modern photography has also undergone a large-scale re-evaluation. It's no coincidence that photographic production from Eastern Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia has been mobilized to contribute to this debate, also indicating a process of art market globalization and a search of the new within a saturated marketplace. The positive benefits of this process are numerous, as for example, attracting investments for the physical conservation of this artistic production, the possible relativization of hierarchies, especially between hegemonic centers and dependent peripheries, the value given to different artistic cultures by interrelating the local and the global, and the possibility of widespread propagation of these cultures combined with the dissemination of knowledge concerning them. On the other hand, this process also involves risks that should not be ignored, such as the danger of dispersing important collections without minimal documentation, the overvaluing of artists and works of questionable provenance and quality as a result of market forces, and the possibility of forming narrow interpretations based on old models that neglect the inherent otherness of these productions. Given this context, our task as researchers and curators is of great importance and presents us with many challenges. With the modern photography produced by Photo Cine Club Bandeirante specifically in mind, there are some questions that I would like to raise. I defend the thesis that these photographers reinvented the American and European vanguards by looking afresh on post-war urban growth of São Paulo. To understand their work, it should not be forgotten that photo clubs were run by and for amateurs. They learned together, adopted conventions, and shared themes. So I ask, how should we think about authorship and originality, fundamental questions for art museums, when analyzing this type of production? How should we react to the uncomfortable similarity between the images of these photographers? The photographers from the club belonged to an economic elite of entrepreneurs, industrialists, and liberal professionals who supported an ideal of progress. Their social conservatism, along with their immigrant background, determined what they showed in their photos, but also what they failed to show. So I further ask, how, in this case, should we interpret the relationship between the visible and non-visible? How should we understand the utopia of material progress present in the photos as opposed to the absence of social inequalities? How should we position those photographers who, in different ways, managed to break with these limits, such as German Lorca, Thomas Farkas, and Geraldo de Barros? Facing such challenges is a necessary task. However, opting to extend the canon at any cost to make it fit the various modernisms does not seem to be the best way to go. The theoretical models consecrated by the accepted history of photography must be confronted critically if we want to construct new narratives that take into account contradiction and difference. Putting post-war Brazilian photography on the map, the title of my talk refers to a social process that develops over a long period of time. It is the result of collective action brought to life by the creative strength of the modern photography produced in Brazil, something that I'm sure has motivated all of us to be here today, this evening. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I do it. Thank you. Good evening. Thanks to Sarah Meister, Abigail Lapin, for the opportunity to come here to participate in the event and present my work. In 1943, the Museum of Modern Art in New York presented the exhibition Brazil Builds Architecture New and Old, curated by Philip Goodwin and photographs by Kidder Smith. One of the works included in the show was the headquarters of the Instituto Vital Brasil in Niterói, designed by Álvaro Vital Brasil. The image on the page 161 of the catalog records the final stage of the construction. At that time, the building was being covered by uniform smooth coatings, while windows were articulated to the building, hiding traces of constructive process so as to suggest architecture as a result of an assembly of components that generate pure planes and volumes dynamically juxtaposed. However, the image includes elements alien to the modern form and its purest abstraction of construction and human labor. One is the horse-drawn cart, whose owners sold articles manufactured abroad and smuggled in, a double sign of the incipient industrialization in the country. Also noteworthy are the men at the top and bottom of the building, of which at least 2 are African descendants. Working manually and without security, they are signs of the mismatch between the architectural forms and their conditions of production and socialization. The followers of the modern movement argued that the new architecture was the logical and adequate result, technically, socially, and aesthetically, of the modernizing process. The mismatch caught by the photo can be interpreted, on one hand, as another example of the limits of the modernization process in Brazil, as many authors have already indicated. On the other hand, with its contradictions, both that building and modern Brazilian architecture can be understood as indices of a modernity already achieved, at least aesthetically, and as factors that contributed to a broader, if not total, modernization. Overcoming the limitations, they would collaborate to achieve the modernity they announced. In this assignment, architecture had a fundamental partner in photography, not only because they could be understood at that time as modes of action of the vanguard agents. Both participated in part of the project conceived by many modernist intellectuals and artists, composing the modern side of the new mask proposal for the nation. Between reality and representation, photography was a special mask used by the agents of the architectural field. More than documenting constructed space, photography relocated architecture to the pages of magazines and books, exhibition panels, enabling it to circulate, gain mobility, and be widespread. Indeed, in its struggle to conquer individuals and institutions, the modern movement of architecture in Brazil greatly benefited from the collaboration of photographers who knew how to translate architectural works into images recorded with light. Complicity nurtured these translations. The reduction of buildings and space to two-dimensional images in black and white could mean loss of the constructive characteristics of architecture, as well as its chromatic power, material reality, and social context. Exalting the form, photography emphasized the ideal in detriment of the real. Kidder Smith's photos of the seaplane station in Rio de Janeiro, designed by Atílio Correia Lima, are an example translating the tectonics of architecture through the tectonics of photography. In the image on page 84, the translation became almost treason, as the building of the Ministry of Education and Health was reduced to graphics due to the photographic capture of the sunshine on the facade with the brise-soleil. A few years later, Geraldo de Barros advanced in this type of graphic transmutation of the architecture in the photoformas, in which he invalidates the tectonics of iron structures so as to construct abstract images by means of the framing, the manipulation of the negatives, and even the assembly of the works. At the Photoforma exhibition, held at the São Paulo Museum of Art in 1951, he took care of how to exhibit the series thoroughly, exploring objectual configuration and spatial intervention possibilities with photography. In a somewhat exceptional photo from the Photoforma series, he starts from a domestic wrought iron grill. The artisanal sense persists in the artist's manual interventions in the negative. And unlike what he did with other images, which he proposed as almost immaterial and floating planes, this is configured as an object with its own matter, form, and weight. Object condition that is highlighted by its title, African Mask. Title and graphic interventions that minimize the indicial nature of photography in favor of its iconicity. with no reference to the original iron piece, but to masks, artifacts created and used by people. As object, this photo is almost a being. Banned in other images of the series, the body reappears, presupposed or represented. So far as I have dealt with architecture and photography as components of the modern side of the mask conceived by modernists for Brazil, and particularly with photography as a mask of modern architecture. But what about when an artist transmutes architecture photographically into a mask? And moreover, when he poses next to the piece, establishing a homology between the mask and his head, the pedestal and his body, an act that added to the physiognomic similarities and the embodiment of the image accentuates the anthropomorphism of the work. Heloísa Espada, here present, has already indicated that, based on Mário Pedrosa's studies on the psychology of the form, and particularly on his idea of virgin art, Barros adhered to the modernists in their attraction to objects of supposedly primitive cultures. The link with the African mask, a crucial topic of modernism, allows us to see the range of his references and how he was interested in the ambiguity of the photographic sign. However, he adhered to primitivism with a generalizing reference, at the same time reverent and violent, to African cultural artifacts, and to which, involuntarily but necessarily, the silence on the enslavement of Africans and Afro-descendants in Brazil between the 16th and 19th centuries, as well as their social-cultural unfoldings, was added. Both Kidder Smith's image and Barros' masks articulate Africanity to the relations between architecture and photography in Brazil in mid-20th century. If the former left trace of the social marginalization suffered by Afro-Brazilians, the later connected himself with a stereotyped Africa through European art and disregarded the blackness that surrounded him. Alternatives to these modes of exclusion are found in the works of Marcel Gautreau, José Medeiros, and Pierre Verger. French Gautreau and Verger were rooted in Brazil. Gautreau in Rio de Janeiro from 1940, Verger in Salvador from 1946 onwards. Medeiros also migrated from Teresina in the Brazilian northeast to Rio de Janeiro in the southeast in 1939. But the three continued to travel throughout the country, configuring singular trajectories and works that crossed many times, not only because of the documented topics. A strong point of connection is constituted by their representations of Afro-Brazilians, in which there is no shortage of photographed translations of architecture. Among the three, Gautreau was the most engaged in the modern movement of architecture in Brazil. Many of the images with which the modern Brazilian architecture was widespread are his. But he also collaborated with the movements for the preservation of popular culture, the other side of the mask set by the modernists for the country. Either at work or partying, the working class is present in his work, documenting that does not inhibit him from experimenting and articulating photographic tectonics with indications of precarious working conditions and the marginal social situation of Afro-descendants. In this sense, his images of Brasilia are emblematic, on the razor's edge between apology and disapproval of the monumentality proper to architectural modernism in Brazil. Less ambiguous, the series that documents the construction of the National Congress makes explicit the persistence of artisanal, abusive, and insecure work that disappears in the pure and abstract forms. Also critical is the series he produced on his own initiative with the inhabitants of Sacolândia, which means bagland, a settlement improvised by workers and their families on the outskirts of the new city, which he considered, I quote, a beauty of initiative and intelligence, end of quote. This series is of particular interest not only for complementing the other series, allowing us to perceive the maintenance of segregationist and marginalizing practices in the new Brazilian capital, but above all, by the way in which he frames and controls the light so as to translate the almost organic relationship of people, certainly Afro-descendants, with the environment. Verger, by contrast, is known for his dedication to black cultures in Brazil and in other regions of the Americas, as well as in Africa. His images constitute a fundamental chapter in the process of Africa's valorization in Brazil and, consequently, the Afro-Brazilian identity. The somewhat ethnographic way of recording cultural manifestations does not prevent him from capturing the social conditions of Afro-descendants or from discreetly expressing a homoerotic gaze. His work includes images of architecture in a smaller proportion, but also meaningful. He experiments with purist abstraction as well as with photographic translation of architectural spatiality. But he did not fail to observe the lack of security of Afro-descendants in manual labor situations, or their precarious housing conditions in the city, offering subsides for the ongoing exclusivist criticism. In the extensive set of photos dedicated to the Afro-Brazilian religions, few specifically focus on terreiros, buildings, and spaces, which are presented mainly as places for performing rituals. Although architecture generally occupies a second place, the recording of its components contributes to the understanding of both the physical limitations experienced by those people and the ways in which these limitations are overcome. Although simple, paper flags and foliage, as well as clothes, configure other environments and bodies for the extraordinary manifestation of the religious. Quantitatively, Medeiros does not rival Verger in photographic documentation of Afro-Brazilian cultural manifestations, let alone Godreau in relation to modern architecture. Chronicler of Brazil, and especially of Rio de Janeiro in the period before the capital city of the country was transferred to Brasilia, black people appear in his images as artists or anonymous citizens that he chose as symbols of the people. However, he is responsible for a crucial and traumatic event in the history of the relations between photography and Afro-Brazilian religions. One of the first records of an initiation in candomblé, published in the magazine O Cruzeiro in 1951, which shocked different social groups due to the sensationalist way the report revealed religious secrets. His gaze is more circumscribed to ritualistic events than Verger's. Architecture literally occupies the edges of these images, although they do not fail to expand meanings. The precariousness and spatial limitations are architectural evidence of the social restriction of these religious practices. The Coca-Cola calendar and the pin-up card are clues to how those people were affected and dealt with mass culture. The homology between painted walls and painted skins reiterates the architecture at the same time as shelter, extension, and metaphor of the human body. It should be noted that in mid-20th century, popular settlements and Afro-Brazilian religions were not really new artistic themes in Brazil. Representations of favelas and candomblé rituals have won the public since the end of 19th century, with works by Modesto Brocos, Eliseu Visconti, and Augusto Malta, among others. The attraction for blackness is even a threat of modernism in Brazil, which gained momentum from the 20s in works by Tarsila do Amaral, Lazar Segal, and Oswaldo Guilde, among many others, reaching the generation of Hélio Oiticica and beyond. However, the representation of these themes by Afro-Brazilians gained visibility in works such as those of Heitor dos Prazeres and Walter Firmo. Regarding this, it is important to note that none of the photographers I focus here today were Afro-descendants. Barros created for himself an African mask, a rare event in the country. Godreau, Medeiros, and Verger proposed masks which were negotiated and accepted by Afro-Brazilians. And this is confirmed by the various glances captured by Godreau and can be assumed in the cases of Medeiros and Verger, even if their photos try to erase the photographic interaction. It's rare to find Afro-Brazilian architecture composing the modernist mask of Brazil, even its side composed by popular culture. Blacks were rarely seen as contemporary producers of the visual arts, especially architecture. This is a differential in the images of Godreau, Medeiros, and Verger. Although the architecture constructed and used by Afro-Brazilians is rarely the main object of their viewpoints, they include it as an important element of the masks they propose for the Afro-Brazilians and for the country. Although there is no reference to particular aspects of African cultures, the blackness of creators and users of Sacolândia is unavailable, allowing us to understand it as a black environment. In the images of Medeiros and Verger, the blackness of the people stands out, as well as the way in which they reinvent Africa in their environments and bodies with limited resources. In the photos of the three, the relationship between human body, built space, and nature stands out, outlining an architecture conceived for life and constituted in the midst of living. What is an Afro way of modestly and marginally contributing to the construction of the Brazilian society and to the configuration of its masks as a nation. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Sarah and Abigail, for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. Well, I will start with a quotation of Augusto de Campos. Where are you? Thank you. During one of the biennials in the 50s, the personal meeting between Valdemar Cordeiros and Tomás Maldonado took place. It was funny to see when they greeted each other. Both were around 75 inches, but Maldonado had more style and was more elegant due to the beautiful cufflinks that adorned his shirts. Well, this picture made by Peter Scheier during the first São Paulo biennial echoes, in a way, the memories of the Brazilian poet Augusto de Campos about the first encounter between Valdemar Cordeiro and Tomás Maldonado. It shows 4 young artists who were engaged in abstraction and concrete art along with the famous tripartite unity by Max Bill. From the left, we can see the Brazilian Abraham Palatinic, the Italian Valdemar Cordeiro, future leader of Ruptura Group, followed by the Hungarian sculptor Casimir Feyer, both living in São Paulo since the end of the World War II. On the right, standing the Argentine concrete artist Tomás Maldonado. Although they are posing for the camera, the picture registers some unforeseen details. Firstly, it's surprising to see the artist leaning on the sculpture in a situation that would be unthinkable nowadays. Despite the fact that we cannot see Maldonado's cufflinks, Cordeiro seems indeed a little bit reserved with his arms crossed, while Maldonado seems confident and relaxed in his elegant stance. The picture is part of a set taken by the German photographer Peter Scheier during the installation of the first São Paulo Biennial in 1951. The material is remarkable for what it tells us about the Brazilian art scene in the 50s, about the first biennial installations, and the museological practices in São Paulo during those times. Besides, it exemplifies the main features of the photographic work by this German immigrant who arrived in Brazil as a Jewish refugee in 1937. Different from other European photographers who immigrated to Brazil in the 30s and 40s, like Alice Brill, Hildegard Rosenthal, Hans-Günther Flieg, Marcel Gauthiereau, and Pierre Verger, apparently, Scheier became a photographer in Brazil. We know very little about his life in Glogau, his hometown in Germany, where he studied at a business school and worked at the department store of his parents. When Scheier was 23 years old, in 1931, he moved to Hohenau, Austria, where he kept working in the family business. Based in São Paulo, since 1937, his first job was in a fridge company. Around 1938, in parallel to this job, he sold lampshades, and in order to make this activity easier, he started to take pictures of the pieces to organize a catalog. The experience would encourage him to look for a professional position as photographer in São Paulo. The scholar Anat Faubel mentions that Scheier would have lived for almost 1 year in New York during 1940, but unfortunately her studies does not clarify the reason for his staying in the United States, so nobody knows exactly the reason until now. Maybe it was related to photography, probably, since in 1940, back in Brazil, the same year, he opened the photo studio of Peter Scheier. From 1948 to 1952, Scheier collaborated with the magazine O Cruzeiro. Probably as a result of this work, in 1947, he started to take pictures regularly to the Museum of Art of São Paulo, better known as MASP, documenting archives, activities, and architecture, in charge of then of Lina Bobardi. At the same time, he collaborated to the magazine Habitat, published by MASP and edited by Lina Bo. Even if it's possible to imagine that Scheier had been in contact with a modern visual culture during his time in Europe and the United States, in Brazil during the 40s and 50s, we know for a fact that he was in contact with immigrants who had a large experience in the fields of modern art and modern photojournalism, as the Italian journalist and art dealer Pietro Maria Bardi, director of MASP, and the French photographer Hermanson, in charge of the editorial reformulation of O Cruzeiro in 1943. In 1951, Peter Scheier was hired by the first biennial to photograph the event's backstage, its installation, the opening ceremony, and the delivery of prizes. The pictures show employees installing artworks in informal and posed scenes. Here we can see workers installing paintings of Yves Tanguy and a sculpture in foreground, a piece of Calder that took part of the North American delegation in charge of MoMA. The composition is organized in superimposed layers, and people in a supporting whole are framed by fragments of artworks. The ladder on the right and other stuff spread on the floor help to create the idea of a work in progress. Besides, the picture shows three situations occurring simultaneously and independently. The crouched man is isolated from the workers in charge of hanging Tanguy's painting, who have no connection with the other one working on the ceiling. Other pictures show international personalities like René Denancourt, who was directly involved with the organization of the North American delegation. The images show Denancourt working, in this case, and informally conversing with Brazilian critics and artists. Despite their informal position, a strong flashlight coming from the left reveals that they were conscious of being photographed. Once more, contemporary artists pause at the scene of the man smoking and touching an artwork. For the photographer, the important at that time was to highlight the contact between local and international personalities that had been promoted by the biennial. Here, in a similar situation, we can see the Brazilian engraver who had a special role in this biennial, Oswaldo Guilde, talking with the French writer Georges Duhamel, in charge of the French delegation. And here, other example of the Scheier's practice of organizing the space here, and actually here, in different superposed planes, with the goal of involving people into the artistic environment of the biennial. Okay. The set includes anecdotic scenes, such as this one on the left, showing two young Brazilian artists, Marcelo Grossman and Ademir Martins, taking a nap. Like other local artists, they collaborated in the installation of the biennial as a way to be in contact with international personalities and artworks. The setting also includes views obviously prepared by the photographer as a way to contrast simple and illiterate workers with erudite art, reinforcing the idea that the biennial brought high culture to a naive audience. This kind of rhetorical strategy has roots in Scheier's experience at O Cruzeiro from 47 to 53 and became very common in his career. In 43, the magazine hired the French photographer Hermanson, who had immigrated to Rio de Janeiro in 1940, bringing with him to the country an important modernist repertoire constructed through the contact with the constructivist and surrealist photography in Paris during the 30s, as well as his background as photojournalist of the French magazine Match. And a parenthesis here, it's essential to mention that I'm talking here about Hermanson and O Cruzeiro came from the fundamental work of Helouise Costa about these issues. Match is known by its sensationalist approach, constructed by unusual and impressive views that most of the times were induced by the photographers. Here we have a famous example of this kind of situation. This matter called Nijinsky, produced by Manzon when he visited the Russian ballet dancer interned in a Swiss asylum in Switzerland. Manzon was accompanied by the dancer Sergei Lifar, who started to dance in front of Nijinsky, that was very sick on that day, inducing him to dance too. Manzon photographed the scene with a hidden camera, creating a photo reportage that ends with the old master in full jump. Yeah, of course. In 43, Jean Manzon introduced the concept of photo reportage in O Cruzeiro, having Match as the main example. In Peter Scheier's works for this magazine, we can recognize a modern language with diagonal angles and close-ups, as well as the same kind of staged scenes that featured Manzon's work. During the 40s and 50s, the contrast between the modernity and preconceived ideas about what would be the primitive Brazil was a common strategy at the magazine, as it is evidenced in this famous picture by José Medeiros, who was part of the O Cruzeiro staff. In a subtler way, we find a similar argument in this image of Scheier depicting a quiet scene in which two employees are cleaning the floor of the room with Sophie Toibarb's works on display at the first biennial. Poor people of mixed race, they are typical representatives of the Brazilian population. Scheier's first pictures about MASP were published in O Cruzeiro, like these ones, to the reportage announcing the museum as a small village of civilization. So you can see clearly what role the culture and the museums and these institutions has on that time. The museum was inaugurated in 47 with an impressive collection of masterpieces of the Renaissance and of modernism gathered by Pietro Maria Bardi. Besides, Meister proposed an agenda deeply committed to contemporary art and engaged with the education of the local audience to appreciate modern art, as well as the local elites to produce modern art. In a large view that included architecture and design. In 1950, the museum went through its first refurbishment, designed by Lina Bobardi. On this occasion, she designed a big vitrine that she called the Showcase of Forms to separate the permanent collection gallery from the temporary exhibitions of modern art. Into the showcase, Pietro Maria Bardi exhibited a diversity of objects of daily life from prehistory to contemporary times, next to shells and other natural shapes. Far from an evolutionary approach, this furniture allowed a simultaneous vision of the museum's collections, along with multiple shapes and shows also, and the exhibitions of modern art, such as Le Corbusier's and Max Bill's owns, that presented paintings and sculptures, among photos of building city plans and projects of industrial design. After 1953, Scheier dedicated himself to his own studio and to work with modern architects, with advertising and industrial photography. During his trajectory, he authored 4 books, among them São Paulo, fastest growing city in the world, published in 1954 on the occasion of the 4th centenary of São Paulo, and Brasília Vive, launched in 1961. All of them was essentially pieces of advertisement about these places, engaged in constructing an idea of modern and developed country, and without black people. The book on São Paulo seeks to present a cosmopolitan city in a large panorama, its main economic activities, its verticalization, places for leisure. I couldn't bring all, but place for leisure, good food, and commercial activities, including the apartment sales. Nevertheless, it's composed only by views of downtown, the richest part of the city then. This couple of pages includes a picture of Oscar Niemeyer with an illustration of the Copan building, then in construction. Sorry. Here. Just in English and French, the book has geared towards a very specific public. Brasília Vive was an attempt to convince people that it was possible to live in a city constructed from zero, isolated of the other urban centers of the country. The book gathers amazing views of the monumental axis, where the photographer explores his way to superpose layers through the large glasses panels of Niemeyer's buildings. He shows also kids going to school in a city in construction, people in supermarkets, and wandering on the streets. The book includes the rhetoric visual learned in O Cruzeiro, like focusing on a tale instead of depicting a whole situation, and also the coexisting of different realities, times, and shapes as it used to be exhibited by MASP. In a way, a showcase is also a stage, since Scheier's modern photographic language strongly collaborated to create a visual rhetoric about modern Brazil, just as the Brazilian modern architecture he photographed. I would like to conclude with a question for us. What kind of modernity are we researching and talking about? A real modernity, or at times a staged one? I believe that the answers lie not only in the formal approach of this production, but in the attentive analysis of singular trajectories, which include photographers involved with photojournalism, photograph of architecture, advertisement, and the practices into the Photocine Clube Bandeirantes. Thank you.
Hello, thank you all for staying. It's really a pleasure to see so many of you here tonight. And I want to thank my 3 Brazilian colleagues and Edward, but especially those who traveled so far to give us insight into specific areas of your research. I have to begin as the newcomer in this world to say with a note of gratitude. And I certainly need to acknowledge first and foremost Heloísa Costa and Heloísa Espada, but also many other people who either have been so generous with their time and their knowledge, or whose own written scholarship in Portuguese, thanks to Abigail that I can read, or in English, have really shaped my understanding of this moment. So forgive me for naming a few of them in particular: Sergio Bergi, Rubens Fernandes Jr., Paulo Herkenhoff, Aleika LeBlanc, Zueller Lima, Adele Nelson, Luis Perez Oramas, and Renato Rodrigues da Silva, because their research and their insight have been essential to me in so many ways. So my adventures with Brazilian modernism began in 2005 when the museum acquired its first 2 photographs by Geraldo de Barros. Including this one. I was struck by this radical twist on the photograms, let's say, by Man Ray or Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, that I so knew and loved. And I was intrigued by the way in which the self-portrait that we acquired at the same time employed a technically identical rectangular band of light to such a dramatically different effect. I began traveling regularly to Brazil in 2012 in conjunction with the museum's CMAP research initiative, and one of the most significant consequences of those travels to date is that the museum collection now boasts more than 50 extraordinary examples of Brazilian modernist photography, including these 2 acquired last year. I'm deeply sensitive to the perils that you pointed out, Heloísa, and all I can say is that I hope that a combination of that sensitivity and a belief in our partnership moving forward will help us address some of the best of them, or the worst. These 2 by Altschul and 8 other works by her are now on view in the exhibition Making Space, Women Artists and Post-War Abstraction. However, this talk is not about me, but about 3 museums that were uniquely attentive to the achievements in painting, sculpture, and photography in the middle of the 20th century. Let's begin with a young Brazilian named Thomas Farkas, seen here on his honeymoon in 1949. Farkas enclosed this photograph in a letter that he wrote to Edward Weston, whom he had visited the previous year on a trip to the United States. It seems Farkas's parents were not terribly enthusiastic about his relationship with this young woman, and they had sent him abroad in the hopes, at least in part, that a bit of distance might cool his affection for her. Evidently, it did not. Farkas was only 24 years old when he and Melanie Hatchek were married within a few months of his return to Sao Paulo, an event that was of sufficient interest to the photography community there that it earned this notice in the bulletin of the Fotocine Club Bandeirantes, that spirited group of largely amateur photographers who revolutionized photography in Brazil around the middle of the 20th century. Both de Barros and Altschul, as mentioned before, were FCCB members as well. The caption beneath this image notes that after the ceremony, the newlyweds passed beneath an arch formed by the tripods and cameras of their fellow bandeirantes. So it was no coincidence, though, that Farkas visited Weston in California during his trip to the United States, or that his personal life would be followed with such interest by an esteemed group of photographers in their monthly magazine. Farkas had been a member of the FCCB since the tender age of 18, and his precocious talent with a camera is only partially explained by the fact that his family established a very successful chain of photographic supply stores in Brazil. He was clearly well liked. His affectionate postcard from the U.S. to his fellow bandits back home was reported as news in the November 1948 issue of that bulletin. Not surprisingly, during his trip to the United States, Farkas also stopped in New York, where he paid a visit to Edward Steichen, who was then director of the Department of Photography here at MoMA. We know of 2 photographs that he made during that visit, actually here at MoMA. This one, in which we see Georgia O'Keeffe's painting, Farmhouse Window and Door, near Sheeler's American Landscape, and this one, made in the exhibition Timeless Aspects of Modern Art, which opened on November 16, 1948. Museum records indicate that the O'Keeffe was removed from that installation on December 8th, which allows us to be certain that Farkas visited MoMA during the last 2 weeks of November or the first week in December 1948. It was Helouise Costa who first pointed out that Farkas had been deeply impressed by this visit to MoMA, and in particular by the exhibition design here. On January 14, 1949, Farkas wrote to Steichen, quote, "How impressed I was with everything in the museum. What I saw in the States was excellent, like a cold shower on a warm day, refreshing and invigorating." And at the beginning of the same letter, Farkas mentions a group of prints that he had sent to Steichen the day before, including this one, modestly writing that he hoped Steichen would find them technically suitable. They were, of course, much more than that. Again, with characteristic humility, Farkas concluded, "There is something else. In Sao Paulo, there will be a Museum of Modern Art, opening January 25th. Somehow, they put me on the photography committee." But Farkas mentions nothing of the plans for an exhibition of his own work that would open at that museum in July. Here we see Farkas seated at the center of that exhibition, called Photographic Studies, with the architects Miguel Forte and Jacob Rushdie, who had been responsible for the exhibition design. Zueller Lima has noted that without the guiding hand of Lina Bobardi, the exhibition design at MoM in the early years did not have the same innovative character as it must be, so it's not that surprising that Farkas would enlist outside help. But just what had Farkas seen in New York? Timeless Aspects of Modern Art, as I mentioned, opened on November 16th, but it's not evident that this would have been a relevant precedent. Perhaps this small exhibition, titled Art in the Neighborhood, Focus on World Unity, on view for most of November 1948, had been. But if Farkas had missed that, he would have seen this, photographs by Bill Brandt, Harry Callahan, Ted Kroner, and Lisette Modell that opened on November 30th. I just want to draw your attention to the varied shades of the panels against which these footprints are displayed and their rhythmic placement. I would also like you to note the way in which the prints are mounted and trimmed to the edge of each of their images. Although Farkas could not have seen In and Out of Focus because it closed in July of 1948, it is certainly possible that Captain Edward Steichen showed him installation views from this major recent exhibition, his first as director of the Department of Photography. Pairs of images from these two views, on the left at MoMA and on the right at MoM, allow us to compare, for instance, their elaborate floor plans, or the geometric forms at the entrance to each exhibition. Note there the stairs to the balcony that I'll mention in a moment. The prints that were installed on freestanding structures, and if you look here, I will use this pointer. This is the picture of O'Keeffe, and this is the photograph he made of timeless aspects of modern art that were both on view. Panels mounted in front of large windows with no shades. Our conservators would never let us get away with this now. Photographs against light and dark backgrounds alternating. And friezes and suites of images installed to maximize their graphic effect. The FCCB published this assessment of Farkas's exhibition in their bulletin in July 1949. Farkas did not conform with dominant conventions and broke the shackles to focus on researching rhythms that were more popular and dynamic, escaping the prevalent romanticism. Since his early practice, he expressed the courage to challenge the canons of classicism, focusing more on content than form. And I just have to say again a thank you to Abigail, without whom my pathetic attempts at Google Translate would really fall flat. But MoMA was not the only museum in Sao Paulo that was attuned to the potential, to the creative potential of photography. So when MoMA opened in January 1949, MASP, the Museum of Art of Sao Paulo, had been open for just over a year, since October 1947, in the same building. MASP was on the second floor, later expanding up, and MoMA was on the third floor with the balcony accessed by those stairs I mentioned earlier. The building was constructed as the headquarters of Diarios Asociados, a media conglomerate owned by a man named Francisco de Assis Chateaubriand, Chateau to his friends, and Brazilian citizen Kane to those more attuned to North American notoriety. Chateau's dream was to establish an art museum in Sao Paulo, and he did so with the help of Pietro and Lina Bobardi, whose story is a fascinating one that's simply been hinted at tonight. Chateau had been discussing opening a museum with various members of the Paulista elite, but when they parted ways, he opened MASP, and this other group would soon establish MoMA. MoMA's first executive director was another Francisco, or Cicilio, Matarazzo, a prominent industrialist who worked closely with artists, architects, and intellectuals to build a program that rivaled MASP's, but with a more exclusive focus on modern art and a particular allegiance to abstraction. Although MoMA's institutional structure and programmatic ambition were closely related to MoMA's here in New York, one must mention, for instance, that the art dealer Karl Nierendorf, with many close ties to the Guggenheim Foundation, had also had a strong influence on Matarazzo's thinking. And as mentioned before, there is one notable individual who bridged the divide between MASP and MoMA. This was Nelson Rockefeller, who served as a trustee of MoMA for many years and its president from 1939 to 41 and 46 to 53. Rockefeller's interest in Latin America was linked to his personal philanthropy as well as his role with the U.S. State Department, and he traveled to Brazil in 46, 48, 50, and beyond, in part to nurture the fledgling art museums there. Even before the end of the Second World War, he corresponded regularly with several key figures in Brazil, including the founders of MASP and MoMA, as well as the Modern Art Museum in Rio de Janeiro, another significant institution founded shortly after the Second World War, but without the consistent early dedication to photography, so thus outside of the scope of this talk. Rockefeller's support of American interests abroad often dovetailed, not coincidentally, with MoMA's initiatives, including one to circulate pedagogically laden exhibitions that could broaden the museum's proselytizing reach. One of these, known as creative photography, and I show you 4 panels here, was sent, technically sold, to the Municipal Library of Sao Paulo in 1947, but its limited scale and the fact that it included only reproductions of works of art lead me to think of it as a footnote rather than a key element in this story. So if Farkas's exhibition was at the vanguard of MoMA's program in July 1949, de Barros's exhibition at MASPI in January 1951, titled Photoforma, pushed that boundary even further. Here we see de Barros, closest to the camera, with Pietro Maria Bardi, MASPI's director, at the center, looking at a panel onto which 4 of de Barros's photographs are affixed. The photographs confuse one's sense of real and imagined space, with some prints being multiple in-camera exposures hanging alongside others that are images of found objects and their visually superimposed shadows, the voids and the tones of the panel itself, as well as the stark contrast between some black and some white frames on the photographs, weave these components into what really I consider a single work that resists categorization as a photograph or a sculpture, 2 dimensions or 3. Roberto showed this slide before, but it's pretty irresistible. De Barros undermined the sanctity of the 2-dimensional rectangular photograph even further by transforming it into an object that accentuates the perspectival limitations of the camera, irreverently etching and altering the original matrix. Again, thank you, Roberto. We like the same pictures. With this conflation or explosion of categories that these works represented, it's small wonder that the exhibition wasn't mentioned at all in the FCC bulletin. There were at least 3 contemporary reviews in the local press, including one by the painter Valdemar Cordero, who was a painter at that point, and Heloísa, Espada, and others have added invaluable nuance to this interpretation, but I believe there is still more to do, particularly around the tension between figuration and abstraction and the role in photography in navigating this distinction, and particularly for this evening, the place of photography within these institutional structures. Photography had been a part of MoMA's program formally since 1940, and conceptually for many years before that, reflecting our founding director Alfred Barr's commitment to modernism that looked beyond painting and sculpture. In that the organizational structure of MoM was modeled so closely on MoMA's example, with some notable departures we ought to add, such as the decision to sponsor an ambitious international biennial, something that MoMA in New York had never dared to do. It's not all that surprising that MoM would appoint a photography committee even before the museum opened, and that Farkas's exhibition would take place before that institution was 6 months old. Photography at MASPI might be read as an expression of a different kind of pedagogical experiment, as Bardi proclaimed in 1950, differentiating between a greater and lesser art makes no sense at all. Yet the radical departure that de Barros's work represented may have surprised even Bardi, who wrote this rather cryptic account in the accompanying brochure. And again, thanks to Abigail. Giraldo's teachers, and I'm quoting Pietro Maria Bardi here, Giraldo's teachers are painters who renounce the figure, from Kandinsky to Mondrian to Bill, and from whose worlds of vague and mysterious content, poor and rejecting, and at the same time so ambitious and infinite from the beginning, he, de Barros, reaches a pure language, still non-distinct, but still an artist's language. Bardi may not have known exactly what to make of what de Barros was doing, but he knew enough to include him in the program. I'm focusing on these 2 photography exhibitions because they are the first at these institutions, and thanks to the ongoing efforts of the artist families, they are also the ones around which the deepest documentation exists. But they were not isolated incidents. MoM held exhibitions of German Lorca's photographs in 1952, as well as the photographic component of the second Sao Paulo Biennial in 1953, which is worthy of a whole panel on its own. MASPI followed de Barros's exhibition in 1951 with one of photographs by the Argentine Ana Maria Heinrich, and later in 1951, Francisco Albuquerque in 1952, and Otto Steinert and his students in 1955 that Heloise has written so beautifully about. And of course, not only did the FCCB regularly install exhibitions, but they organized annual salons, inviting international participation, and they often sent their members' work abroad. By 1953, MoM had moved to its current home in Ibirapuera Park, and by 1968, MASPI had moved to this striking building, designed by Lina Bobardi. My interest in this moment stems from the fact that this activity was not limited to the work of a handful of photographers who lived in a single city, albeit a large and important one. The FCCB network in Sao Paulo involved hundreds of practitioners, not all equal, but interesting at its scale, but dozens of whom demonstrated distinct and notable talent, and the salons in which they participated were frequently international, so the best of this work was seen widely around the world. As this painting, representing the next chapter in the career of de Barros, and as the exhibition Making Space puts forward, the relationship between painting, photography, and sculpture in Brazil at mid-century is a significant one, and one that I'm looking forward to continuing to explore. My research will surely be enhanced by the papers being presented tomorrow, and together I look forward to expanding the dialogue around these extraordinary works. Thank you.
So thank you. I think you'll all agree with me that there were immensely interesting and thought-provoking ideas going around in these talks, and all of them, I think, meshed one with another in a very beautiful way. So what I would like to do is maybe pose one question that seemed to me to have been, or theme rather, that had been interwoven through all of the talks, and maybe have each of the members of the panel comment on it, and then open the floor to questions or comments from you. And we have about 20 minutes. So it's 20 minutes of 8, so about 8 o'clock. I think that one of the things that I was most interested in is the focus on the cosmopolitan nature of this photographic world that we've been talking about in both cities, although the emphasis, I think, was principally on Sao Paulo, but also Rio, of course. And I'm interested to know all of your opinions about this, well, somebody mentioned the word mestizagem, the mixing, the blending of foreigners and Brazilians. So you have people like Verger, you have Gertrude Altschul, and you have working side by side with Geraldo de Barros and Medeiros. I wonder if this intense mixing of foreigners had a particularly strong consequence on the formation of a modern view of photography in Brazil, particularly in Sao Paulo, the quintessential emerging city, leading to the even more quintessentially emerging city of Brasilia. So that is, it's really just about the cosmopolitan nature and the mixing of foreign artists and their Brazilian contemporaries. I don't know if does anybody, the Heloísa, want to make a statement about that?
My English is not so fluent as I would like it to be, so perhaps I would need some help. But I think that this characteristic of cosmopolitanism in Brazilian modern photography is just now being studied. Because when for example, when I start studying FCCB production, we didn't have primary documents about their production, and the interviews they gave me was always to say, oh no, we didn't have any information about what were made in abroad, because they thought, I think, they think that to give the references would be something bad for evaluating their production.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the new generation of researchers that are now in the academy studying these characteristics you point of cosmopolitism, and I think that tomorrow we will have some issues about that will be very, very interesting.
Good, good. Heloise, do you want to make any more comments about that cosmopolitanism?
Yes, actually, I believe that not only regarding photography, all the modern experience in Brazil, in particular in São Paulo and Rio, are related with the fact that many immigrants came to Brazil during the 30s and 40s, and we had, as I told, Pietro Maria Bardi and Lina Bobardi, who had a great experience in Europe. We had the Hermanson and many other people. For instance, as I told, I showed Valdemar Cordeiro, Casme Fer, many people who came from countries that had suffered a lot during the war, that had to escape to the Europe, like here. It's very close to your history, but in another size, of course. But I think what I try to tell is that to show is that I believe that in case of Scheier, to me it's very clear that he was his educate, his of eye is related with this contact with these immigrants. Yeah. So another point to be considered is that Photocine Club Bandeirante, that had also immigrants, had a large connection with other countries. It's part of the history of photo clubs in all whole world during the post-war, and this is this web of contacts. The kind of exhibition that they did that time was used to circulate a lot. We are going to touch this, I think, tomorrow. And it was a very cosmopolitan spirit, right, and very interesting. But I think that MASP, especially, of course, biennial in 51, but MASP had the project to be a museum school. They were really engaged to form people, and I think that they did.
So it had a pedagogical.
Yes, I think that in case, for instance, Geraldo de Barros, that was a man that was in touch with many different groups at the same time, not only with Photocine Club Bandeirante. What he did, I think it's very connected in many ways with MASP, including because he became a designer. His main activity was design during 30 years.
And Roberto, could I ask you to comment on the same idea of the intervention of foreign artists in the case of your talk, particularly the Gautreau and Verger, and how they formed or helped to form or deform a view of race in Brazil?
Yes. I think Verger is crucial for that, because even today Afro-descendants look at his books and even to reenact some rituals, and so it was crucial, especially his work trying to connect Brazil and Africa, trying to make explicit what was practiced in both sides of the Atlantic. I think it's more obvious. In this sense, on the one hand, he shows what was not perceived, socially perceived, but on the other hand, you're right. It has the risk to deform the images in the sense that those religious practices, they had a life of its own, the tradition changing through time. And after those books and the success of those books from the 8th on, it may have started to change those practices after those books. In the case of Gautreau, I think it has not the same force as Heloísa has written about the Sacolandia series, and unfortunately he did not do the book he wanted to do. And I think it's a pity because José Medeiros had the opportunity to edit the book with his photos after the O Cruzeiro edition, and he tried to show another vision. In my opinion, the original scene is inside the photos, since he paid to photograph those rights, and so from that moment on, they will be inside those photos. The sensationalist view that departed from O Cruzeiro to him. But in the case of Gautreau, I think those series are very special because after that moment, I mentioned that favela was a topic before. We can see Augusto Malta photos and some photos, but the popular settlements will be more studied and photographed afterwards and after that series. And I think they are very important in the way he tries to show. I try to say that how he shows us the links between those people and the environment, and how they transform what was leftovers from the construction of the abstract capital into their homes, into their ambience. Yeah. And it's totally new. In that sense, I wouldn't say he deforms. I think he's trying to translate that powerful way of creating a new environment.
Very interesting. And Sarah, you did the opposite. I was intrigued by your tracing the presence of Brazilian, particularly Farkas, in the United States, and that sort of cosmopolitanism moving in a different direction. So Brazilians coming here, talking with their American collaborators and friends and fellow photographers. Do you think that there was much of that interchange Brazilian-American in the period that you were interested in?
You know, it's interesting. I do think the dialogue was not one-directional, and that was certainly one of the things I wanted to point out. But the networks that Heloíse was pointing to, these ideas of the salons, the exhibitions that would Brazilian photographers would, from the FCCB, would send their pictures to abroad. What's amazing to me is that where they were sending their pictures, and the American photographers whose work are reproduced in those bulletins and those salons, I have heard of none of them. There is a, to speak also to the question of pictures that look, what do you do with pictures that look similar? Or what do you do with the fact that some of the Photocine Club members took pictures of nudes and kitties and schoolgirls and all kinds of pictures, that those things coexisted, and that coexistence is actually exacerbated, I think, by their contacts with the U.S. So whereas Farkas was connecting with Weston and Steichen and making very, I think, fruitful conversations in both directions, the pictures of Farkases that are here, we have 7 of them that he sent to Steichen in 1949. Right. But the rest of the contacts between American photographers, I'm not sure that was really to the benefit of the Photocine Club. And by contrast with that, I think there was very fruitful contact with Otto Steinert and Photoform in Germany. So I think what will be really interesting is to look at these connections and where they produce really interesting, innovative work and where they don't. And how do you grapple with both of those things?
Right. So it's a very rich panorama that we can come at through this section of this theme of cosmopolitanism, but I know I can sense that there are people who have been thinking of questions for a while. So Abigail has a microphone, and if you would, Abigail, there are several questions over here on the other side. So I
We
think
have two microphones, actually.
Oh, there are two.
So-
Sorry. So you gentleman in the gray shirt, you're number one.
I'm Luca Tateo from Aalborg University in Denmark. Actually, if I understood correctly, your talk, you all say that actually photography was confined within a specific, let's say, social class or cultural milieu, and was functional somehow to the modernist program, social program at the time. So, and what I understood is also that, in a certain sense, the other parts of the Brazilian society at the time, so different colored groups or mixed groups, not to mention the Indians, they had actually only two fates possible in that photography. One was to be silenced, for instance, in architecture photography, and the other one was to be voiced. So somehow was talking on their behalf. And if I, for instance, if I think to the Museu Afro-Brazil in Sao Paulo as well, there you see, as I remember, photography as a kind of side position with respect to other artistic forms. So my question is, I understood correctly that in a certain sense you say that photography was a class form of expression in, so to use the word class, it's kind of old-fashioned word, in that specific period in Brazil, and if not, if there was also there were also other forms of photography from other social groups.
Well, I didn't mean class, but we could say that. My question was when I was invited, and it was wonderful to have the opportunity to look at some photos which are very interesting for me, and I think to document Afro-Brazilian religions. And at a certain moment, I had to face the fact that none of them are Afro-descendants. And if you think about, you cannot find, maybe Helouise and Heloísa can help me and say, no, you have this photography. I just remember about Walter Firmo, but his work is later than these ones. And so I had this problem, let's say, because in Kidder Smith's photo, which I have worked with when I wrote about Vital Brasil, I think it's a very powerful image because it can be used as a symbol, a special symbol of that moment in which black people are marginalized, and it's a way to see that. And so they would be out. They construct the buildings which they cannot live in, and they don't photograph. We have to wait until the moment when you will find Walter Firmo, Eustáquio Neves. Am I wrong? The name is his Eustáquio. Eustáquio Neves, and many others. But besides that, I think that Gautreau, Medeiros, and Verger, with differences, they translate that, and especially with Gautreau and Verger, black people assume those images. In my opinion, we see that in Gautreau's images. In the case of Hergé, we have it not explicit in the image, but also in the use the black communities they do with those photos and his books. The Medeiros case is a problem because up to now people have problems from the Terreiros. They have problems with that series because they don't accept that, because it's a problem to photograph what should be a secret. And so you have a trauma up to now in this relation between photography and religion, Afro-Brazilian religion. I don't know if I answered you, but I would just like to point that, in my opinion, photography has not a secondary place in Museu Afro-Brazil. On the contrary, I would say that Emanuel Araújo, the curator, he mixes all the languages, and I would say that Pierre Verger and Mário Cravo Neto have a special role in the permanent exhibition of that museum. I would say that Araújo counts very, very deep with photography to present Afro-Brazilian people. In that sense, he is reaffirming the position of those white photographers in translating the Afro-Brazilian world.
I can actually attest to that, having had many conversations with Emanuel Araújo and his deep respect for Verger. And his presence in the Museu Afro-Brazil seems to me quite important. But I'm not here to answer the questions. I'm here to ask them. So do other panelists want to address this?
I actually would like to throw something out there, and then I would like for Heloise and Heloísa to tell me if I'm wrong. But I think it's super interesting, the question of an amateur photo club that achieves such notable and prominent place. But it's important to remember that the amateurs in that club, while there were, businessmen and doctors and lawyers and people who, were certainly upper class people, there were many others who were taking advantage of the fact that it was an amateur club because they worked for a living. And Gertrudis Altschul, her day job was to make flowers for millinery. So she made artificial flowers. That was her job. I do think that the question of, German Lorca has spoken of part of his reason for leaving the club in '52 was a feeling of he really needed to work, he needed to make a living through photography, and that put him at odds. But I wonder maybe whether that's a way of also understanding something that I can't quite grapple with, the distinction between the photojournalists and the FCCB members. If you were a photojournalist, you were making your career, you were making a living through photography. And I wonder if there was a sense that that was somehow antithetical to what was happening at the FCCB, where you were expected to be making, either not need to make a living or making that living through other means. Did I say it too quickly?
No,
Okay.
I don't. Let me.
Or
try.
so wrong that you don't even know where to start.
Two things. First, until I know, really, there are no black photographers on this time. No. Photo Cine Club Bandeirantes. I think that what many things that we are talking here is related with the fact that we have parallel experience at the same time, not directly related, but of course, in O Cruzeiro, that was a very, you don't know, but we couldn't talk actually very well about O Cruzeiro here because it was very important in the major magazine on that times, and everybody knows of Cruzeiro. Once we have a modern language, a photojournalist language, but a modern language in a magazine like this, of course, people from Photo Cine Club Bandeirantes were in touch with this cultural visual. But they had no direct connection. I think that to think about these works from the photographers of Photo Club or Cruzeiro is essential to think about the places where they are working. O Cruzeiro was a very sensationalist, and that was always trying to create this idea of a modern country in contrast with a primitive one, and most of time Indians and black people are related with, are showed as primitive. It's a view very full of prejudice, very complicated, and very we have to do a lot of criticism about this. Heloísa did. And on the other hand, Foto Club Bandeirantes, what was their goal? What they want to do? They wanted to do artistic photography, and it's difficult to think about this production, I think, without have this in mind. And we have some people, some photographers in Foto Club Bandeirantes that have wider connections, wider ambitions than, I think, the Photo Club. So, because of this, I think it's very important to see each other and to try to understand what they are trying to do.
Well, I agree that there was different institutional places where where modern photography was being made in Brazil, and the links between Photo Club and photojournalism are fragile. I think so. We can see perhaps Thomas Farkas. Yes. I think that the relationship between him and José Medeiros is very powerful for transforming his vision of a formal experience that he had at the beginning of his trajectory to an engaged production that we see better in his films after that. This is the more strong relationship that I see between these two institutional places, as we can say perhaps, and the photojournalism, the photographers of Cruzeiro, for example, we have to study one by one because they come from different contexts as immigrants, and they came to the magazine with this luggage, and they interacted there to make a new production in Brazil that time. But I think that that there is a lot of things to explore in this relation. You are sure?
Could I add something?
Sure. You can answer, yes.
Yeah, not an answer. I think we should include other institutions, especially in the case of Gautreau, his work for the IFAM, the National Heritage Institute.
Yes.
It's very important, as well as his work with Edson Carneiro in the campaign for the folklore and popular art. I think those, you have many institutions. In the case of the IFAM, you have the contact with the architects and art historians and people like Lúcio Costa and Carlos Drummond de Andrade. I think you have a special intellectual and artistic ambience important to comprehend other implications besides photojournalism and the amateur club like.
Just one comment. Is very important to talk about Gautreau in this case because Gautreau had a previous experience in France in Museu de l'Homme. He worked there, and he had a very a background, an interest regarding anthropologist photography. So his interest, he worked in Brazil, looking at modern architecture happens in parallel of this anthropological interest. This is one thing. Another thing is that I remember here, now we are talking, that all of this has to be seen in an editorial context. That there is a very interesting book, Brazil, published in 1942, I don't know, that it was published by a French publishing.
Blaise Sandras.
No.
No?
No. It's a publishing house, a French publishing house that made, on that time, books about different countries, and they did one about Brazil, with pictures of by Gautreau, Pierre Verger, and another one that I forgot, another French one. And this book is very interesting because you can see they present the Brazil in the 40s, a place of with brilliant, the country of the future, a brilliant future in a Pacific relation. On one hand, a great nature, a lot of source to richness, and a very Pacific place. So in this context, the pictures of Gautreau and Verger of black people all the time try to show how this convivência, how can I say, how they live together in a peaceful way. Of course, it's a construction, and it's important, I think, to reflect about. Mm-hmm.
So, do we have time for one more question? The gentleman in the salmon shirt.
Hi, very nice presentation. My name is Edson Cadet, and I'm Brazilian with the Afro Press Media. You mentioned about the mixing of immigrants, artists, immigrants, and Brazilians, but you forgot to mention that it was white immigrants with white Brazilians. So Brazil had a huge population of blacks going to Brazil. We still have there is slavery, the last country of abolished slavery, etc. Now, my question is, why it's so hard for Brazilians to accept that there is racism in Brazil? Not prejudice, but blatant racism.
Let me defend myself.
The Brazilians must speak.
Well, actually, we're talking about the 40s and 50s that the immigrants, the immigration is more related with Europe because of obvious circumstances. We are not. Your question is. No, it's not hard to. It's essential, and it's much more than photograph. It's a big problem in many circumstances. Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery. So, and we have a kind of society very different from organizations very different from United States. And there are many sociological studies about this kind of false, peaceful relations. People have great difficulties to organize themselves in civil movements, and it's a very hard and deep problem, not only related with black people. but I, of course, agree with you that this problem with that we don't face clearly this problem is all the time exposed. So it's impossible to answer you. It's
Any other comments on this provocative subject?
I would say
Important
simply
subject?
that they don't recognize the existence of racism because they don't want things to change.
yes, simple like that.
So perhaps on that rather...
I just want to add that, I don't know if this is working.
Tomorrow. You're holding a mic.
Hello. I wasn't sure this one was. Tomorrow, we're having a panel on race and circulation and immigration photography at the CUNY Graduate Center, which is at 365 Fifth Avenue, so on Fifth Avenue between 34th and 35th. And I think this, all of the questions today and the themes that we discussed are going to be fleshed out, and I really encourage all of you to come. Sarah and I want to thank all our very esteemed panelists and moderator for such a great conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. It's good. Give people a second chance. I figure most people had never seen yours before, so then I want to show them the panel. Or the Helouise, anyway. Yeah. We had a lot of, you put this image in your PowerPoint, and then